I think this will be the last one that I record for the night, but that's all right because it's the last one for the week 10. So metabolic adaptations. So the first objective is review, but we're going to talk about lactate threshold, RAR, and submaximal O2. And then also, it's not on here, but the last slide or the next to last slide talks about the interdependence. And so that's something that we're going to talk about in class. It'd benefit you to kind of have an idea of how all these systems work together to improve aerobic performance. But that's something that hopefully you'll be able to pull together. So you got to remember, lactate doesn't cause fatigue, doesn't cause soreness. In fact, it's beneficial, right? It acts as a buffer. So pyruvate combines with hydrogen ion to form lactate. And then when lactate leaves, it brings another hydrogen ion out of the cell with it. So you could make an argument that lactate takes care of two hydrogen ions within a cell. So lactate is produced when there's a lot of pyruvate, a lot of hydrogen ion, and so it kind of takes care of that. So it's beneficial in that it acts as a buffer. We can use it to create glucose through gluconeogenesis in the Cori cycle, and then it can be used as an energy source. And I've alluded to this, that there's some evidence to say that the heart especially really likes using lactate as fuel. So remember, lactate is correlated with fatigue, but just because it's correlated doesn't mean that it causes it. All right. Just what we think is happening is just because there's an increase in lactate just means that body's not able to use it. And so we're not able to clear it out. We're not able to have it go through the Cori cycle. We're not able to completely use it for fuel. In other words, production is outpacing utilization. And this is probably occurring because there's low oxygen. And so this happens at higher intensities here. Now with training, two things happen. One, we don't produce as much, so it's able to keep those lactate levels low. And then we're able to clear it out. Okay, and so what happens is, hit a button, is that our lactate threshold, we actually shift this curve. So notice that the trained or the untrained individual in the red line, that lactate remains constant until about 65% of max is hit. So right about here. So that's where we go from flat to steep. Whereas someone that's trained, or the same person that's trained, they hit their lactate threshold at 80%. Okay. And so a lot of times aerobic athletes will train at or near their lactate threshold because that's where they can get the most bang for their buck. They're going to be able to run at that pace or train at that intensity for a long time because they're able to take care of the hydrogen ion and the CO2 and all the other things that build up. And so as a result, they're going to get stronger. And so it's really when you get above this lactate threshold, that's where performance time decreases. You're not going to be able to hold that for as long. And so if your training shifts that curve, that's going to be beneficial for you. Next is that RER actually decreases as well for a given intensity. And so remember, RER ranges from about 0.7 to 1.0 depending on what you're doing. And that RER gives us an idea of what kind of fuel sources you're using. And so when we stay at a lower RAR, closer to 0.7, that means we're using more fats. And training allows us to be better able to use those fats. And so RAR stays relatively low. And then as a result, we can work at a higher intensity before relying on those carbs. And then able to work harder at a higher intensity for a longer period of time because we've got these carbs available that we can use for the high intensity activity. Remember, carbs, even though they don't have as much energy, and even though our carb stores are much, much smaller than our fat stores, carbs require less oxygen and we're able to break them down more quickly. As we've discussed several times in this unit and previously, training doesn't change submaximal VO2. To do a given activity requires a specific amount of oxygen. However, submaximal VO2 probably after training actually decreases a little bit. That's not because the oxygen demand has changed, but what happens is you're getting better at whatever that thing is that you're doing. So you're becoming a more efficient runner. You're not running like Phoebe from Friends. You're running like not Phoebe from Friends. Okay. Remember, we've talked about this in class. if you were to look at my son running, he's actually pretty quick for a 4-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old. He's 4, almost 5. He ran an 11-minute mile a couple days ago. It's still very herky-jerky, right? It's not smooth. Whereas if you watch, any of the people that are on the track team run, what they do, it's actually really, really smooth. They're wasting very little movement so that they're able to devote all their energy to actually just running fast. Maximal VO2, which is what we've been talking about this entire unit, it's the best indicator of aerobic fitness. That's kind of what we started with earlier this week, and so that's going to improve. However, the more trained you are, the smaller you'll see those improvements. Okay, so sedentary individuals are going to see some huge gains when they initially start, but as they become more and more trained, it takes more and more effort to get smaller and smaller changes, right? We've talked about this a few times in class, and it's not even just an aerobic thing, but we've got the fastest guy in the school to try and qualify for nationals in the indoor 60 needed to shave something like 0.03 of a second off of his time. I don't think he did it. He came close. But he's training, he's working hard, and he's doing this for 0.03 of a second. Okay. Whereas if I were to go out and train for a couple of weeks, I'd be able to improve my 60-meter dash time by, several tenths of a second, if not more. So finally, it's important to remember that VO2 and what determines your VO2 is determined by at least 5, if not more, of the systems. Okay? You've got cardiovascular, respiratory, muscular, endocrine, nervous. I would argue that urinary is in there. And I would even argue that your integumentary, which we never talk about, but skin blood flow is in there too. And so all these systems, as they work together, are going to determine what a person's VO2 max is. And so here are your final objectives or final review questions for the aerobic part. All right, and we will talk a little bit more next week about changes in VO2 max and the specific systems and how they can be limiting.